All right.
Okay, admittedly, it takes me a moment to sort of reprocess what our prompt is.
Hey, Emily, what document are you looking at?
So I just reopened the Google Doc that Jacob chatted to everyone at like 2:20.
Can you
It's the same.
me by any chance?
So what was who was looking for the link?
I just sent it to you, Tate.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So was the prompt to kind of go through, like discuss the options before us, and some of the pros, cons?
Within sales tax.
Just
Within-
sales tax?
Yeah, well, at least it said sales tax when we were moving into this group, so I assume that's what we're talking about.
Okay, so like that specific one as opposed to discussing some of the other options.
Yep.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
So group one, so I don't know if everyone had a chance to read the summary or look at the considerate public feedback, but I think that's probably helpful.
It was the least popular option, I think.
That, and then also the fee to Pena, I think was also pretty
Right.
unpopular. So,
You know, I'm curious about, like I keep coming back to kind of the way that, like Portland had structured the clean energy fund work that they did, and you know the ballot measure that, and the way that they've approached it. And I believe that folks who are familiar with this, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a sales tax measure, but it was like specifically oriented towards stores, like essentially big box stores that did 500K plus in like revenue annually. So it wasn't like small businesses, mom and pop shops. It was, you know, your Target, Best Buy, some of those shops. And obviously it still has a regressive element to it because sometimes those costs do get passed on to consumers. But, you know, I'd be curious if we made a proposal that tiered it out in that way, if it would be more popular, because as you mentioned, it was like the most negative feedback on this one. But you know, it kind of changes things when we're talking about big stores as opposed to small businesses.
I'm sorry, are you suggesting a system in which sales tax would be higher at a big box store than it would for a comparable item at a small business?
It would be taxes on the total revenues from that store.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
it
but
would,
think
sales
that
tax
was
is
what they
for
did in
item,
Portland.
right? I mean, if you're talking about total revenues, you're talking about income tax, not necessarily a sales tax.
I'm trying to remember how they did it in the Portland system, but it was if you had over $1 million, I think, in profit, not even in revenue, then there was a tax that applied to them. I'm not going to try and explain the tax because I don't remember right now. I don't think it was an income tax.
No.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like beyond the small business side, large business side, the reason it's regressive is also just in buying basic goods for, you know, family welfare, whether you buy them at a local store, at a big box store, that's going to impact lower income people more. So I'm not sure. So that might address some sort of issues with the small business impact, but it doesn't necessarily address low income impact. And I'm not sure if there's another way to do that.
I think there were some exemptions around, like it didn't apply to groceries, medicine, like a few of the, I don't know. I would need a little more information on that, but I just wanted to kind of get our conversation going about, you something that's potentially an option in a way another city has addressed it.
On a quick Google search, it says that big retailers with revenues of more than $500,000 in Portland and $1 billion nationally, so they have to have both, will then pay a 1% surcharge on their Portland sales.
Okay.
And the estimate would be it would raise 44 to 61 million annual.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it doesn't sound like that's the model that was analyzed or proposed on the public site. So that might be something else.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Something different.
Do we have any questions to start with for the budget folks?
Well, I think the easy one is what's the implication since this change on what those revenues are going to look like and how does that impact just city budgets now?
When you say this change, you mean COVID?
Just the COVID.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because that's the reason why the state and the municipalities are all seeing such dramatic decreases is those sales tax, lodging taxes, those sorts of things. So to the extent that then you propose an increase while you're decimated,
Yeah. It's going to be a
Wait,
hard time.
do we have any city budget people in here who have done a production that says what Denver's loss in revenue is going to be?
They've said about $180 million.
And that
Though.
accounts for the fact that the state is not sharing their federal relief with the municipalities?
That is just a direct loss, is what they've said so far. That doesn't include any money we're expecting. I don't think. I don't work for budget.
Gotcha. And does anybody know what the city's budget is? So, for instance, the state's loss of $3 billion represents 10% of their budget. Is $180 million for the city roughly equivalent?
So I don't know off the top of my head. I could throw out some guesstimates, but I'd hate to be wrong on that. But I also don't necessarily think we should go down that rabbit hole maybe right now, and kind of maybe try and stick on just this sales tax. I think the biggest question is just how much revenue would it generate, but I think we could assume that in the near term it would be a lot less than what it used to be, and in the longer term hopefully it would recover and be back up to, hopefully the trends that we were seeing pre-COVID. That might be a year or 2 or 3 away, but hopefully we would recover to some extent. And presumably this tax would last for quite a while, so it's not just a short term.
Yeah, and out of some of the options, like even sort of that 0.25, like the projections for the revenue are pretty significant as compared to some of the other revenue options. So that, stands out to me. I am curious, and this is just as someone that has a little less familiarity with like how our tax measures move forward on the ballot, but I'm curious about like if we can be specific about what the use of some of these funds are, if it is talking about like where the money goes, if it goes to the general fund or if it would be like a specific enterprise in some way.
I think when you vote on these, it has to go to a specific purpose. So it would be like whatever those proposals are, this tax would go to that specific. But I think you're right. I mean, when you look at all the other ones, together, this is the one that generates the most funding with sort of the smallest increase compared to some of the others, but has kind of a regressive, nature to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's also possible, so there were a few different sales taxes considered. And so for instance, there's the general, the food and beverage, and the short-term car rental. So just looking at the comments, it seems like a few people liked, for instance, the short-term car rental. I mean, that by itself is not going to produce very much, and especially this year, but there are, more kind of targeted things that you can do versus just general.
Yeah, I'm curious if there is a targeted way to like move this forward on certain like types of purchases that people, you know, like maybe a higher tax on gas appliances, or, you know, like things that are polluting versus, you know, making other consumer choices.
So I don't know if you guys know how the taxes on rental cars work. In lieu of use tax, there's a $2 flat fee per day per vehicle that's charged and goes directly to the Department of Revenue. That's filed on a state form. You may want to make sure that they have not declared that a matter of statewide concern, because that would preempt cities from charging taxes on top of that, even in the case of Denver County, which is home rule.
I can look back at the notes. I didn't see that flagged as a concern, but it's possible that it was. I think they tried to flag wherever it was possible that there would be legal considerations.
If we give them a temporary password, does that solve the problem?
But we could ask that.
And I'm sorry, I don't have the document in front of me. What we're talking about is a clean 0.25% increase to the sales tax rate, right? The city and county sales tax rate.
There's a couple of different proposals.
There's like a general tax base only or a total tax base that's just general food and short-term car rental. Well, but that actually generates more funding. I mean, so 1% is $180 million a year.
I don't think that this is set up.
Okay,
A 0.25% is 45 million. It's a lot.
So for someone who voted for this tax increase, we would be taking totality of sales tax for a buyer in the city and county of Denver to 8.25%. Is that correct?
It's not,
I don't know what the current rate is.
and it's not written out that way. There's a couple of different options that they consider here in terms of it's 1%, 0.5%, and 0.25% in terms of what they provided to us.
Right, but this is the worst damage would be 8.25. So we'd be on par with places like Chicago.
Yeah.
Do we have any suggestions in terms of any changes that we would suggest to make it better in terms of concerns around equity or popularity or structure, et cetera?
Well, it's like if you compare one over the other, right? Like if you compare what a per kilowatt per therm tax would be compared to a sales tax, and whether people feel differently about those, or I mean, the challenge with this one is it generates a lot of money easily, and people understand it compared to some of these other ones that are more complicated or more industry specific, or hurt some businesses more than others. I think that's something to consider.
I agree. I think the challenge is that it's much harder to give exemptions.
It is. But the exemptions can cost a lot of money. I mean, like when you're trying to exempt, like the problem with the current proposal that Resilient Denver has is in the language it exempts low-income households, but it's very difficult to exempt low-income households on a utility bill. And that's one of the problems just with that proposal. So to the extent that if everybody benefits from the revenue that's generated, everyone should participate in paying for it. That's one argument.
Yeah, and I think that there's another side of this coin of some of the political challenges of really the city needing to be able to articulate like what new services and benefits the residents of Denver will enjoy because of this potential increase. So like that's sort of another element to this and part of making any of this successful.
Well, we've asked that repeatedly. What is this money going for? And they've always said, we're just giving a list of options to the task force. We're not actually sure what that's going to be.
Yeah, and I mean, some of those programs are things that have been like discussed in some of the smaller groups, like around, options around buying down RTD service or incentives around new efficiency projects are going electric, or like some of those are things that are on the table, that I think that the city would need to articulate pretty clearly to voters. What I'm curious about from folks who were participated in the revenue subcommittee, I'm curious, I feel like something that was really clear to me in the presentation was that, a lot of these options are regressive ultimately to varying degrees. And, someone who's not necessarily a tax expert, I'm curious about if there are effective models out there that aren't regressive, or, where we're talking about like finding pathways to some of the biggest polluters, like contributing more into, the revenue for the city as opposed to individual residents. And, I feel like we haven't fully captured that with all of the options, but that's something that, always sticks out to me values wise.
We did talk about different sort of luxury taxes and high use taxes on energy consumption. So that certainly came up, and I think that's in the longer list of things. I don't think that those got the public feedback because they get a little more complicated. Mm-hmm. I think the issues there are just often they don't produce that much revenue total compared to taxing everyone. And then with taxing everyone, it is often regressive if it's on any sort of basic necessities like energy. Everyone needs energy to some extent. And then it's a question of whether or not you can do exemptions, how complicated it is to do exemptions, and then to Jennifer's point, how much that cuts out from what you're making. So it's just like a really hard balance. I think with some of these sales taxes, just looking at what we're supposed to provide, what we need to do is, would we recommend this to move forward? I mean, number one, it's pretty unpopular if it's just a general sales tax. I do think it's possible to keep it to something like short-term car rentals, which do have, a more clear tie to climate change and maybe would disproportionately be for business, rather than sort of have a low income impact. I don't know. But obviously the amount that would be produced is going to be way smaller. It's just not going to be that significant compared to the general sales tax. But
what were some of the
my
luxury...
main con is just I don't think it's going to happen right now in terms of recommending this one. I don't think that the city council should spend time on trying to push a proposal that I think is going to be very unpopular this year.
I think the other thing that just kind of ear to the ground that I'm hearing is usually the sales tax is the top contender because it's so simple and people understand it, and so it's easier to weigh and measure than our other samples. Like in particular, the Resilient Denver initiative is very complex. And so I think the default on a revenue raising when people don't understand it is just to vote no. So I would think that some folks might think so if we're weighing like the pros and cons of this one, it's very simple, it's very straightforward. To use Matthew's words, it's very clean. And it's something that in that sense can be maybe is in its favor. But of course, as we can see, even on the simple polling here, and then even on just now the situation with COVID and everything else, people are going to be very reluctant, I think, to adding or increasing their sales tax.
Well,
and it's not directly related in the same way as some of the other ones were from the impact that we're trying to address.
Yeah, and part of, Dominique, what you had highlighted that was kind of intriguing to me around some of the short-term car rentals piece, even though, that is a small piece of the pie, that is something ultimately, I'd be curious in the breakdown of like folks who are doing business travel and like how those costs are covered by larger companies or corporations versus, individuals who are traveling and, using car rentals. And you know.
Well, it's usually people from out of state that are paying it, that are coming in renting a car versus residents. I mean, that's always been how I've thought of it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so should we try and, I know we only have a couple minutes left. Should we try to, are there any changes we would recommend? And then do we even recommend this moving forward, I guess is the question. I mean, I do like some Reese's point that the reason people like this is it's simple, which is I think true.
But I also think the point of when you're you know, like when you're putting your position on these and you're reading them all, and then you're going back and saying, which one do I like, right? And so people may be more inclined to go to the energy related ones.
Yes.
When you're comparing them all together. But then when push comes to shove, what would be the one that people would approve, I think is what we're looking for. And I don't know. I mean, I think it has to be on the table because it generates a lot of money and it is simple. And I think you have to then weigh the pros and cons that come from asking for a tax, you know, at all. And then of all the taxes that are offered, what's, you know, going to poll the best, what's going to have the best chance of passing. I don't know how else you do it.
And I think there are ways, like it, I mean, is going to come down to sort of a political calculation here. And if we're talking about tax rates going up, but we're talking about, you know, and we're investing in like green infrastructure. There were some infrastructure proposals like from the adaptation team and all of that like get people to work more quickly. Like this is an investment in Denver in getting people to work in good jobs and like kind of talking about it in a cyclical way. You know, that's all rhetoric and or not all rhetoric, but it's like that's going to be part of, you know, if this is something that truly can is simple and generates a lot of money and is a good option for us. You know, it'll be the way, a huge part about it is like the way that we talk to people in Denver about what it means.
Is anybody in this group with the city and county?
Yes.
Okay.
Amber,
yes, me and Amber and Kate are all.
Here's my concern is if this goes to ballot and we're talking about a 25%, 0.25%, 0.5%, or a 1% increase in the tax rate, the folks against are going to come out with a 30-second spot on all the usual places with a list of the taxes in unincorporated Jefferson County, Aurora, Arapahoe, Highlands Ranch, Arapahoe, Centennial, Broomfield, Thornton, and they're all going to be lower than Denver. And we're going to take ours at the highest and say we're now going to increase this 0.5% or 1% to fix the climate problems that the commuters that live in those lower tax jurisdictions are causing. That's going to create a political problem.
Well, there's always going to be opposition. I think the issue is if we need money to make these changes, we've clarified that with all of the proposals that are put in place. There's only a few ways to raise money anymore. And so this is what we have to come up with. I mean, I think there's always going to be the opposition. And I think the role of this group is to say we have come up with the best set of solutions that are going to make Denver the best, you know, in this, and then hopefully people follow along. I mean, I totally get your point. But I think at this point we've got to do something to move forward. That's what we're tasked with, and this is as good an option as anything.
So I think we have a healthy list of pros and cons, right? So, and we can add, you know, mitigating commuting traffic from other regions with lower tax rates as part of the cons, right? And so this one, I think pros, I think we've talked about the highest revenue, simplest to explain and implement. I think cons, we've said regressivity. It was least popular on the thing, least amount of connection to the actual, you know, thing they were trying to hit, and then also just competitiveness with surrounding counties and whose issues are we addressing. I would like to make sure that we captured the questions that we started off with in the beginning, which is just, are there any ways to kind of move back to the, are there other models that would focus on sales tax that could be more like the Portland one, which maybe are a little more complicated, but do kind of help address some of the regressivity. I think that was a question that we started with as well.
I like that. And then just still, are there some sort of luxury sales tax, to Emily's points? I mean, I think those came up and they might not be big producers, but it's worth looking at those again as well. And I would say that we'd probably recommend looking at those rather than just recommending a general sales tax increase to the task force or to the mayor's office and city council, but that's my recommendation.